Ambassador Richard Kuazlarich is a distinguished visiting professor at George Mason Shar School of Policy and Government. He teaches courses in the geopolitics of energy security and energy transition, theory and practice of public policy, and policy communications. He is the co-director of the Center for Energy Science and Policy and represents Shar on the leadership team for the Center for Resilience and Sustainable Communities. He has served as National Security Officer for Europe on the National Intelligence Council from 2003 to 2011. Prior to that position, he was the director of the Special Initiative on the Muslim World at the United States Institute of Peace. He joined the Institute of Peace in 2002 after a 32-year career in the Foreign Service. He has had a long and distinguished career in the Foreign Service. I will just mention one feature of it. He was the United States ambassador to Bosnia and Herzegovina in 1997 to 1999 and to Azerbaijan in 1994 to 1997. He received his bachelor's degree from Valparaiso University and his master's degrees from Indiana University and the University of Michigan. Richard will be speaking about Mackinder's return to the geopolitics of energy security, now transition, or did he ever leave? And with that, please begin.
Okay, thanks a lot for that great introduction, and thanks for the opportunity to speak to this group. I've been an auditor here, and now this is an opportunity to talk to you about a perspective on Mackinder that I developed as a, if you will, a professor of practice, both here at George Mason, but in my diplomatic career as well. And so I do want to start out with what I think, if I've got my technology right, should be a map that's very familiar to anyone who has spent any time reading about, studying about Mackinder. And when I teach my course on the geopolitics of energy security, I start with this because it kind of frames the issue for students who are not familiar with, if you will, the geography of geopolitics. But I also, when I think about the career that I've had, both in the State Department and at the National Intelligence Council, I've sort of served in various places, including Ethiopia and Israel, as well as Azerbaijan and Bosnia, which has put me, I think, in a broader perspective, kind of the way Zbigniew Brzezinski described it in the grand chessboard of a pivot area and a heartland that has gotten much attention, and certainly in recent days. But let me kind of go back about 30 years when I first became involved in the geopolitics of energy security in what I call the Caspian region of the former Soviet Union, and sort of talk about the evolution of geopolitics, in that area, and the intersection of both energy, political relationships, and regional conflict. Because when I went to Baku, Azerbaijan, as a master in 1994, we were looking at the energy picture quite differently then than we are today. It was mainly focused on access to oil that was outside of the control of OPEC. It was also in the framework of the breakup of the former Soviet Union, where all of a sudden instead of one Soviet space headquartered in Moscow, there were now 10 independent states, each of which needed embassies and personnel to staff, and presented quite different challenges, both politically as well as economically. And so, we opened up our embassy in Azerbaijan in a hotel, and it took several years to get off to a good start. Our colleagues at the British Embassy were in a similar position, and we spent a lot of time working with them, looking at the geopolitics of this region, because both of our countries' energy companies had strong economic interests that required cooperation. And inserted into that was the regional conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia, which posed some particular problems for the United States, in that our geopolitical position, which should have been fairly straightforward, was influenced by pressure from the Armenian-American lobby in the U.S. Congress to not provide assistance to or engage in development in Azerbaijan. But long story short, that evolution of the geopolitical relationship to one based on oil and newly established countries very quickly shifted to an emphasis on gas, and the role that Russia and Iran were playing to block the development of these energy resources in the Caspian. Turkey became a more important element in this equation than it was at the very beginning. It became an energy hub for both the transit of gas as well as oil. And there was a very interesting story that I'll just tell a little bit about in a few minutes regarding the Caspian Sea and its demarcation. And by the time we get to the early 2000s, there's the Afghanistan war, which now opened up the optic of geopolitics from a focus on the Trans-Caucasus, South Caucasus region to Central Asia as well, and brought in a broader strategic development that we'll see as very important. This map may be a little busy, but just to point out to you that what complicated the geopolitics of the region was the uncertain status of the boundaries between these newly independent states that emerged from the breakup of the Soviet Union. And it was significant because the offshore energy development, particularly in Azerbaijan, but also Kazakhstan, required some kind of demarcation of borders, a process that took a long time to accomplish, but one that both Russia and Iran were trying to frustrate to avoid having these newly independent states of Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan develop their energy resources. And ultimately, what happened by the time we get to the 2000s, if you will, it was a kind of a success story of international cooperation, of dealing with these pressures from Iran and Russia to disrupt the flow of oil and gas, but most importantly, to build the pipelines that would run from Baku on the Caspian Sea coast through Georgia and into Turkey, and ultimately to global markets there, from Turkey, that is. I mentioned the importance of demarcation of the Caspian Sea. And one thing to keep in mind, maybe fast forwarding a little bit to today, that this is not just a question of energy development, but it's a question of national security relations. Because both Russia and Iran are involved, Russia on its part, in using the Caspian Sea as a basis for launching attacks against Ukraine. Russia and Iran use the Caspian Sea to trade, exchange military equipment. Russia to support the Iranian military development, as we've seen Iran to provide drones and other equipment that Russia is using in the Ukraine war. And so we see this body of water here in the middle of the pivot area of Mackinder, becoming quite a significant feature of the evolving geopolitics of the region. But we had developed this idea because of the success that international Western diplomacy had achieved, that somehow there was going to be a period of stable strategic interests in the region. I like to tell my students that the worst thing that can happen in diplomacy is to have a success, because when you're successful, you try to use that as a template for every other problem that may come down the road. And as successful as we were with oil and pipeline developments in the Caspian, we thought we could use the same approach a decade later with gas, and the same approach in today's totally changed global energy environment. And what we encountered as time went on was that while we expected there to be a kind of Kuwait-like energy resource in the region, there really weren't new energy discoveries. Our energy priorities as a country shifted. We were worried about where do we get the next barrel of oil from a non-OPEC state in 1994 when I arrived in Baku, to today where the United States is the largest oil and gas producer in the world, thanks to fracking and other developments that have taken place in the United States. So those energy priorities have changed. The importance of climate change have become more of a factor in international relations. And these have impacted on the transition, energy transition, which I'll talk about later, but also the impact of COVID and different patterns of economic growth. So I think the lesson, if you will, in a geopolitical sense for the region was we can't really build a long-term strategic relationship on energy alone. This energy infrastructure that was built and is functioning today has become in itself a geopolitical issue. The pipelines in the Caspian region, we go as far afield as North Stream. In the Baltic area, we see where the transit of energy is almost as important as production. We can't really build a strategic relationship around pipelines to China in the same way that we did in terms of pipelines to Europe. Intervening in a conflict such as the one between Armenia and Azerbaijan can't really be based on energy geopolitics alone. And we do have new actors in this space. So understanding that strategic interests aren't forever and that the energy transition has changed the global energy situation so that we don't see this region in the same fashion that we did. What does that mean? We've gone, in a sense, not so much talking about energy security, you listen to the discussions that are preceding the COP29 conference, that is the climate change conference that actually will be hosted in Baku, Azerbaijan, in just a few days. It's a different vocabulary than it was when we were just talking about oil and gas. And so, as I looked at this picture, I asked myself, has Mackinder left? We're into a different energy ballgame and a different geopolitical ballgame. Today's energy economy is all about electrification, and how do you secure, how do you manage electricity security? The transition toward this low carbon future, which the COP29 meetings will focus on, is really based on electrification of the economy. And so the concern is not so much how do you get oil and gas out of the ground and into a pipeline, but how do you ensure that your electricity supply is available for economic development and potentially for export to neighboring countries. Electricity is clean and reliable, and therefore, making that available is crucial for economic growth and societal well-being. And integrating the intermittent renewable energy sources of solar and wind poses technical challenges that are just really weren't there when we were talking about oil and gas primarily. And countries are now shifting their investment priorities and therefore their geopolitical priorities to how do we modernize a grid that enhances energy security as well. So it's a different situation. It doesn't mean that primary energy is going to go away and the infrastructure of pipelines and production facilities will be less important. They are going to be vital. Gas is going to be even more important in this transitional period because it is a cleaner fossil fuel that's available now while countries are looking at the potential of hydrogen and other low carbon alternatives. So what we need is a robust infrastructure that connects the energy supply and demand of both fossil fuels and renewable energy and still ensures energy security. So, how can the international community working together with countries in regions like the Caspian and Central Asia facilitate the flow of energy across borders? So this all becomes, a very interesting question about what does the global energy transition picture look like? And BP, who unfortunately is not doing as much of this internally as they have in the past, has always been regarded as kind of the gold standard when talking about energy development, not just in oil and gas, but other areas as well. And I took this picture from one of BP's energy outlook pieces of, it must be now almost 5 years ago. But they were trying to, map how primary energy use has shifted over the period from 1900 to looking out to 2050, which has been the target date for a lot of the climate change initiatives. And I will just ask you to think about the energy transition that would be required to get to a net zero outcome in 2050. And you see the red line, rather steep slope going up to 2050. That's where all the solar, wind, hydro and other renewable energy would have to come from, and what would have to happen in terms of coal in particular, but oil as well, in terms of decreased consumption during that same transition period. And achieving that is part of the problem that leads to some of the geopolitical tensions that we'll talk about. So just for purposes of illustration, again, another VP contribution. If you wanted to reduce the growth of carbon emissions from what had been an average growth in the period from 1995 to 2015 of about 2% down to, say, 0.5% by 2035, the way that you can achieve that is one of three policy steps. One, you can reduce the GDP growth in your country. And we saw during the period of COVID what happens when you reduce GDP growth. Carbon emissions drop. It's a rather extreme approach, and I'm not sure very many politicians would survive a political campaign based on lower GDP. But it is one way of reducing carbon. The other way is to become more effective, efficient in energy intensity. And then the third, where most of the attention has been, is the mix of fuels that go into to the energy system. And if you kind of see these as three buckets of government policy, the options are not really that great. So we're in a difficult energy transition period where the focus has been primarily on changing the mixture of fuels, but it has changed how a region like the Caspian then appears, and taking account, as I mentioned earlier, of the changed geopolitical situation. So that area that we looked at in terms of oil and gas development has now become a different geopolitical situation with the end of the wars in Afghanistan and between Armenia and Azerbaijan over the Karabakh region. Did Mackinder leave as a result of those changed geopolitical situations? India and China have become more prominent, and transportation now through the Middle Corridor, through Central Asia and to China, and the North-South Corridor. I'll show you that in a minute in map form. But maybe Mackinder returns if we're starting to look at these land transportation connections. And then Russia-Iran. No longer is it just simply an effort on the part of those two countries to block energy development in the Caspian region. It now extends the Ukraine and the Israel and Middle East conflict to this region, and creates as a result new choke points in energy and economic development. And then finally, the expansion of the energy transition process, as I mentioned, the shift from fossil fuels to renewables, and how that affects supply chains on the supply side, but also how that affects the demand side of the energy equation, particularly industrial strategy, which is now increasingly focused on the role of AI. So, if Mackinder whether Mackinder left or not, he's back. But today the challenge is more the geotechnology of the 21st century, and creating what I call this meta conflict between geopolitics on the one hand and energy transition on the other. And that is going to be the defining feature as we move ahead, both geopolitically, but also in economic terms. Mackinder, emphasized strategic importance of land power, but if we look at the 21st century, we've got geotechnology replacing geo-economics as a driver of global power dynamics. We're back to thinking about transportation infrastructure, both for sea as well as land, because of the need to facilitate global trade, energy flows, and economic integration. It's in this area where we're seeing a lot of development, almost impossible to keep up with, that affects transportation, whether it's high-speed rail or electric vehicles, but it also includes AI and data-based economies. And these developments, these technologies are reshaping global trade and reshaping energy consumption. And so we're seeing much more attention to investments in renewable energy infrastructure, not just solar and wind farms, but associated supply chains, which are creating new centers of economic power. So, as no surprise to any of you, China is at the forefront of these developments, taking advantage of their large economy and their connections, particularly in Central Asia and beyond. But the Belt and Road Initiative process, which seems to go through a variety of name changes, has both a land dimension where China is trying to avoid the choke point that goes with the South China Sea and the amount of goods and services, goods and energy that flows through that, but also a seaborne dimension as well. And it's a combination of trade, infrastructure, and energy. What I find fascinating today geopolitically is that both China and the U.S. and the EU, for that matter, are looking at this land dimension of transportation through Central Asia and the countries of the Caucasus and through Turkey to Europe, as a way of competing with China. At the same time, China is trying to develop these relationships as a way of competing with the U.S. and Europe. And so it makes for a complicated geopolitical situation, which now throw into this the impacts of the Ukraine war, the alliance that's being developed between Russia and Iran, and India's own desire to have its transportation link to Europe that is independent of a China-dominated system. And so there's what you could call an Indian alternative to these Central Asia links that would go from Russia south through Azerbaijan and then on to India. And Azerbaijan sees itself as being in a dominant regional geopolitical situation because both the middle corridor as well as the Indian alternative need to either go through Azerbaijan by land or back to the Caspian Sea as part of the link. What it also has brought to the fore, I think, in terms of the geopolitics of the region, is the importance choke points because the land corridors now, with what has happened with the Houthis and the expansion of the Israeli-Iranian conflict, has meant that not only are people concerned about the traditional pattern of maritime choke points, but also the impact that this has on trade. And in all of this, there's also a climate change dimension. People had not paid attention earlier in the year. There was a problem of getting some of the LNG production from the United States to Asia because of drought in the Panama region, which lowered the levels of the Panama Canal to the point that ships were not able to transit, at least of the size that were necessary to move the LNG. But this is, we're talking about, geotechnology. And when we think about choke points, we need to think about the new choke points. And I'm glad that one of our colleagues on the call is involved with cyber, because for purposes of renewable energy development and some of the new infrastructure that's connected with this, we're seeing cyber and IT vulnerabilities become prominent. Whether we're talking about cyber attacks on electric grids or pipelines, it really raises a whole new set of concerns about geopolitical reach and impact on choke points. Can the electricity grids that are developing accommodate all of the new capacity for both renewables and also meet the demand from the AI side? We're either talking about energy systems that are kind of super grids, huge networks spanning a geographic area and crossing boundaries, or developments that are moving electricity off-grid. And either one of these developments increases the vulnerability of these electrical systems to cyber attack. And the more the economy becomes electrified, more the energy system becomes electrified, you end up with an energy system, whether decentralized or not, that is highly integrated. And this increases vulnerability of both economies and societies to power failures. Data centers and Bitcoin operations are very much elements. Another choke point, is basically human. It's public interest groups that are anti-carbon energy. Either they want to eliminate carbon energy entirely, or they want to restrict its development, mitigate the impact of carbon emissions. And we'll see this, I think, at the COP29 summit in Baku. A lot of emphasis on the need for vast amounts of economic assistance to adapt smaller developing countries to the impacts of climate change. And then the other pressure that builds for greater resilience to increasingly intensive storms. We've seen that recently in Spain and in the US and the Hurricane Helene. All of this comes together, generating pressure that increases the potential, if you will, for a choke point on energy development. And there are new regulations that are being considered, particularly on this side of the Atlantic. Biden restricted LNG exports. Those kinds of regulatory efforts can become a choke point as well. So the geotechnology here is really important in this changed environment. unless we think that this is somehow immune to the isolation from regional conflicts. I think, if anything, it's become worse. Warfare in the 21st century, and I'm not a military expert, certainly observing what's going on and talking to people who are experts. There are disruptions in cyberspace, in information networks, and, as I mentioned earlier, critical infrastructure. And these are challenges for both energy security and energy transition. I mentioned the vulnerabilities of energy infrastructure to cyber attacks, and we're seeing in this environment the rise of regional powers and emergence of new geopolitical alliances that are shifting the balance of power away from traditional East-West rivalries to a more multipolar world. And again, Russia and Iran and China are kind of at the center of this. And we're seeing in countries like Azerbaijan, which historically, when we were at the early days of oil and gas development, were very pro-Western, are now moving to a more independent foreign policy position in a multipolar world. And these kinds of shifts can influence energy trade patterns and the formation or the further development of regional economic energy and security alliances. We're seeing that with OPEC, OPEC Plus. There may be no new OPECs that emerge for some of the commodities that are becoming more important for renewable energy development. And then, of course, the role of the BRICS, which just held a summit in Russia not that long ago. So, back to our Azerbaijan connection. Here's a map of, now we're not talking about oil and gas flowing from Azerbaijan to European markets, but a road and rail link that will allow Azerbaijan to connect to Turkey, given the end of the conflict between Armenia regarding Nagorno-Karabakh. And whether that road and rail link is on the Azerbaijan and Armenian side of the border with Iran or on the Iranian side becomes an important geopolitical consideration. So we see that the changes that have taken place with the impact of the emphasis now on technology and the connection between technological development and transportation links comes back to play even in this relatively small part of the world in the South Caucasus. So, what would I say? I guess in answer to the question that I posed at the beginning, I guess I would say that Mackinder never really left. It's just the form of looking at Mackinder's view of the world and its geographic focus has changed as the global geopolitical environment has changed. But it's also a question of the economics and the technology. I think we really need to pay attention to what this electrification of the economy means for both economic development and for renewable energy development. That it's going to cost a lot of money to get the kind of clean energy and the grid that will support that that green energy development. The infrastructure connections will be different, but they're going to be connecting, production and demand in both the traditional energy system, but also a renewable energy system. Oil and gas will not go away. If we're looking at a transition period between now and 2050, even at the end of that, we call the BP chart, there will still be a need for oil and gas for the economy to function. But renewable energy sources are going to become more prominent. One thing I've noticed, and this has been to me a surprise, that just within the last few months, all of a sudden, nuclear power has become part of the debate about a low carbon base load for electric power systems. And large companies like Google and Amazon, who have their own AI systems, are talking about small modular reactors as being a substitute to hooking up to an overly stressed electrical grid, which may not support the growth of demand for electricity over the next 10 to 15 years. So once we get in, bringing nuclear into this, it raises a whole series of safety concerns, but also geopolitical concerns as well. And I guess that leaves us, not surprisingly, from a former diplomat, with the need for international cooperation, because we're into a set of complex challenges that relate both to energy security and energy transition in the 21st century. And those challenges, I think, in a sense, are illustrated by this map, where just looking at a few of the commodities that are critical to solar and wind development, no longer is Mackinder a focus for a relatively limited pivot area involving Europe and Central Asia, but it's global, because we need to protect those supply chain links that bring these commodities to our market and to markets of allies. And if that were not complicated enough, we are going to be looking at development of mineral deposits on the seabed, which pose all kinds of new technological and legal problems, but also geopolitical problems, because these deposits are outside the boundaries of any nation state. And even the Law of the Sea treaty, which the United States unfortunately never signed, isn't really adequate to dealing with these mineral deposits, which are now, thanks to technological change, available for exploitation. And the impact of exploiting those is something that I think still remains to be explored, and requires, I think, a new set of interactions among countries like China, the U.S., Europe, as we move ahead, and the need for getting to these minerals becomes. So apologies if this has kind of created some whiplash as you try to focus from one relatively small part of the world to a global one. But I think it's the reality of geopolitics today, and the economics and the technological pieces are even more important. So I will stop there and let you ask questions.